All right, today we're going to be talking about cells, and I'm just going to jump right in to try to make this smooth. So first of all, cell discovery and theory. How were cells discovered? A long time ago we didn't know cells existed. So it says Robert Hooke, H-O-O-K-E, used an early microscope to study, see, and name the cells. Robert Hooke looked at cork cells. You can see on this picture the type of microscope he used and the cork cells that he kind of saw. Leeuwenhoek was the first person to see living cells. He looked at pond water and those creepy crawlies that we typically see in here. Schleiden and Schwann developed the cell theory, and it consists of 4 main parts. You do not need to know all 4 for your test. I think you need to be able to state 3 of them. The first is all living organisms are composed of 1 or more cells. The second part is cells are the basic unit of structure and function in an organism. And the third part is cells come only from existing cells. That was added by Virchow. Files do not come from rotting meat, but are attracted to it. That says, oh, I said files. It's just be flies do not come from rotting meat, but are attracted to it. Reddy did an experiment where he set meat out, and people used to think that flies generated from meat that was left out and rotted. So he basically set meat out and left it on one plate, and then set meat out and covered it and sealed it on the next plate, and only the meat that had the fly, or that was open, had flies on it. So it was like, oh, maybe meat doesn't make flies. Maybe it has to come from another fly. Like, I didn't realize this until a long time into it. We're talking like 1800s. So that's your cell theory. The last part is cells contain hereditary material which they pass on to their offspring when they divide. A cell is a small unit with the properties of life. And you have to have all of the properties of life, be able to do them all to be considered types of cells. We'll go through 4 of them. Metabolism. It's got a spot where you can define metabolism, but it's basically all the chemical reactions that cause life to happen. So it's doing its own chemical reactions. The ability to respond to its environment, the ability to grow and change over time, the ability to reproduce. And you have trillions of cells in your body. We're going to talk about different types of cells. If you already had me for lab, you would have looked at eukaryotic cells under microscopes, but there's also prokaryotic cells. They're divided into 3 domains: the domain eukarya, the domain archaeobacteria, and the domain eubacteria. So we are going to look at the different types of cells in class. Here's an example of a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic cell. This is a bacteria and a plant cell that you can look at while I lecture. So single organisms are able to survive and perform all of life's functions, yet are only one cell. Those are called unicellular organisms. Prokaryotes, or bacteria, are the simplest and smallest form of life on Earth, and they have no nucleus. They do have DNA, but they do not have a nucleus. Oops. There you go. Prokaryotes, your first blank. All are called single cells. They do not have most of the organelles of a plant or an animal or a protocell. They do have ribosomes and a few other things, but they don't have things like chloroplasts or mitochondria or Golgi apparatus because they do not have membrane-bound organelles. Ribosomes are RNA put together and some protein pieces. They are not membrane-bound. Prokaryotes are believed to be the first living organisms on Earth. They do provide food for many organisms. They're used as decomposers, so they function in rotting and decay. Some of them are pathogenic or pathogens because they cause disease. Some protists are also single-celled. They do have a nucleus, so they're not in the prokaryotic group, but they could also cause disease. Some of them are brain-eating protists. There are antibiotics against, which are anti means against, bio means life, and they are used to kill or slow down the growth if already infected. There are also vaccines, which are produced from dead or weak pathogens that we have to fight against some of these prokaryotic cells, and they are injected into the body. And a healthy body produces antibodies to fight the infected pathogen, which then remain in the body to fight the illness. So you get part of either a weak or a dead pathogen depending on the type of vaccine, and then your body learns to fight against it. Another thing about prokaryotes that it doesn't say is a lot of them are symbiotic, meaning they will live inside of you and help you with a lot of your functions, or they live on your skin. So you have bacteria that live all over your skin, you have bacteria that live in your gut, and they help us stay clean and stay safe, and they help us digest our food. If you get an imbalance of yeast and bacteria, you might get yeast infections. So there are good bacteria, and they do help us quite a bit. Viruses do lack most characteristics of living cells. They are often not included as living because they do not move on their own. They also do not use energy, and they do not grow, and they cannot reproduce on their own, even though they do reproduce. Once in a living cell, it uses the host cell's DNA and enzymes to reproduce. So it has to have an attachment site. So it will attach to a protein on the cell's membrane, and it will inject its DNA or RNA into the cell, and then that DNA will get read and incorporated into the cell's DNA, and then the virus will cause the cell to use its own mechanics and its own energy to reproduce and make the virus. Viruses are 10 to 100 times smaller than bacteria. They're the smallest quote-unquote living organism, again, but viruses are not living. And as far as it is known, all species of organisms have at least one virus that can affect them. No one is totally free from viruses. And I've got a little site up here at the top that shows you how big stuff is. This is on Cells Alive. You can go to it. So this is a nail that they're looking at, and it's 20 millimeters. A human hair is much smaller than that. And then you've got a dust mite, which is here on the magnification scale. You've got pollen and a lymphocyte, which is their white blood cells. You've got red blood cells, which are even smaller. If you look down at the bottom, it tells you your magnification. This is now magnified by probably 5,000 to be this big. E. coli, those are your prokaryotics. They're even smaller. Baker's yeast, which is a fungus, it's larger than that, but it is single cells as well. Staphylococcus is smaller than E. coli. It's 2 micrometers, well, less than 2 micrometers. It's about a micrometer in length. Then you have your Ebola virus, which is kind of like a string there, this is your E. coli in the green. And then you have your rhinovirus, which is your common cold. So it is 20 nanometers. Nano is 10 to the negative 9th. So viruses are very, very small compared to your typical cells. All other cells, fungus, protists, plants, and animals, do have a nucleus. They are eukaryotic cells. And again, they include Protista, Animalia, and Plantae. He forgot fungi. F-U-N-G-I should also be part of that note. It should have 4 kingdoms. Mr. Johnson, you failed me again, sir. Number 1, Protista. Most are single-celled. However, some are multicellular. Protista all have a nucleus and other organelles. Most have mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of cells. You guys should say that from memory now. Some have chloroplasts, which are green, and they produce oxygen. Most protists live in aquatic or marine habitats because it's very hard for a single-celled organism to live in an environment that isn't wet because of their need for water exchange. Some can be diseases. Malaria is a flagellate that swims around and causes major problems. And most are beneficial as part of a food web, so they feed larger organisms. And I'm going to stop there, and we'll go into our next section in part 2 of the notes.